Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll probably still have a few more folks filing in, but we're going to go ahead and start because it's 1 o'clock. So thanks to everybody for joining us today. My name is Gabriella Garrison. I'm the Eastern Piedmont Habitat Conservation Coordinator for the Wildlife Resources Commission, and I'm also the coordinator for the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. So before I hand over the reins to Annabelle, our speaker today, let me go over a few rules, which I'm sure most people are familiar with at this point. But your microphone should have been muted when you entered the webinar. But if you unmuted them, please go ahead and mute yourself again. And also, if you could, turn off your camera just to minimize distraction to Annabelle during our presentation, her presentation. There's going to be plenty of time for questions during or after the presentation has ended. So during her talk, if you do have a question, please drop it in the chat box and I'll make sure to ask her at the end of her presentation. And when she is done, I'm going to also drop her contact information in the chat box. So be on the lookout for that in case you have any questions that you want to ask her afterwards or if you just want to connect with her. And then lastly, this webinar is going to be recorded and we'll put it on our YouTube channel within the next week or so. And I will send out an email through Eventbrite as well to let you know when it's on our YouTube channel. So just a quick background on this group, the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. We are a partnership of roughly 27 agencies and organizations across the state with interest in pollinator outreach and conservation. And we have 6 committees, but this webinar series has been brought to you by our outreach committee. And I feel like that's really the bread and butter of our group, outreach, trying to educate people about the importance of pollinators and help them with creating pollinator habitat and why you should do it and how you should do it. So if you want more information on our group, we have a website. It's there, ncpollinatoralliance.org. We're also present on social media, including Facebook and Twitter. And all of those are good ways to contact us if you have any questions. And then these are some of our partners that are involved in what we do. And so you can see we have some government involvement, some NGOs, some private involvement, lots of diversity with our partners. And then finally, so this has been the second in our webinar series. We had a webinar last month about fall garden cleanup, and that's on our YouTube channel. And then we're going to have one more webinar in November on the 4th. And Dr. Casey Raymond is going to talk about a study that she did on the effect of glyphosate on honeybees. So that should be a great one. If you're interested in attending, keep an eye on our website and our Facebook and Twitter, and that's where we will drop the Eventbrite invitation in just a few weeks. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and let Annabelle load her talk. And while she's doing that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Annabelle. She is the curator of the Bloomquist Garden of Native Plants at the Sarah P. Duke Gardens in Durham, North Carolina. And she's been with Duke Gardens since 2011. She has a garden design diploma from the English Garden School, Chelsea Physic Garden in London. And when you're ready, Annabelle, the floor is yours.
You're muted. Apologies about that. It was in the wrong place. So hello, everyone. And I'm sure you can hear me now. Yeah. Okay. So I'm Annabelle. And as Gabriella said, I'm here at the Sarah P. Duke Gardens in Durham. And I'm just going to put that down too. It always starts slowly, but it gets in, once I get in the flow, I'm okay. So I think actually she covered quite a bit of my background. I'm British, as you can probably tell, and I've been here at the garden since 2011, all this time working in the Bloomquist Garden of Native Plants. But before that, I've got a degree and a PhD in botany and applied botany, and I worked in industry and in research in universities. But around about 2003, because we traveled a lot as a family, I decided, I'm going to take my passion, which was gardening, and I'm actually going to become a garden designer. And in Britain, we do landscape architect courses and things like that, but traditionally, we call ourselves garden designers, particularly for those sort of domestic homes, sort of at houses rather than actually sort of places like, parking lots and, neighborhoods and things like that, which you have more of here, because Britain, doesn't do as much big building as you seem to do here. So, and then before we came to the US in 2008, I was working actually as my own little business called A Touch of Green for a few years. So I'm at Sarah Pete Duke Gardens, and I'm assuming some of you have been here, and I'm assuming some of you haven't been here. So just a brief introduction to where we are. We're actually on Duke campus. We are about 55 acres. This is a picture of the historic garden at the center of the gardens. It's the oldest part and was built in about late 30s, just before the Second World War. Helen Biddle Shipman was the designer of this particular part of the garden. We have what is called the Charlotte Brodie Discovery Garden, which I think is one of the most beautiful parts of our garden in total at Sarah Pete Duke Gardens. This is a very diverse garden, vegetables, organic vegetables, fruit, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that particular garden later as well, in terms of plants and insects and pollinators. I actually have the honor of being the third curator of the Bloomquist Garden of Native Plants. I became the curator in 2018, and before that I was the horticulturalist. We have an Asiatic garden. It's about 9 acres, Southeast Asian plants, a very beautiful part of a very beautiful landscape as part of Duke. And then we have another part of the garden which is more about, again, it's honoring sort of landscape architecture and gardening in terms of water gardens and around the Duke Visitor Center, where people have weddings. There's a white garden and a little bit of a mixture of different types of gardening styles. But coming back to the Bloomquist Garden itself, we're the second oldest part of the gardens here at Duke. We're about 7 acres, and it's a garden that was in honor of Professor Hugo Bloomquist, who was actually the first professor of botany at Duke University. And his specialized area was in Southeastern plants. And when he passed away in 1964, his colleagues, friends, and family, said, we really need to have a part of Duke Gardens at that time, which was really only the historic part of the garden. We really need to have part of these gardens on the campus representing the most amazing plants that we have here in the Southeast. And so the garden was established in 1968. And the garden actually is also part of our job too. It's not just, we just don't do horticulture, but we also consider things like, designing bridges, for example, this fern bridge here. Although we don't actually do the final design, we use architects to work on things like that, like the Prairie Classroom here. But we put a lot of our own ideas into the type of garden structures that we actually want to have. So we work with the architects to create something that we would like to have. And in the center here is the Prairie Classroom. The Prairie was established in about 2014, 2015, and I was a big component of actually doing the Piedmont Prairie. And at the sort of the one part of the Prairie, we have about 1 acre of it, is this beautiful structure and classroom. And we've just recently had it paved here with sandstone, and I've just this week had these benches put back into the classroom and had them redesigned and restyled, because we get a lot of visitors, a lot of school kids and obviously students from the university who want to work in these areas. So in terms of this specific talk, what I'm going to cover first is basically, why plant for pollinators. I'm assuming because you're in listening to this talk, you're really interested in that, or you may know more than me about this. I want to also look at the importance of urban environments in this aspect too. Garden design, regarding, what sort of design gardens, what's important in the design for pollinators and wildlife. And then a little bit about more about the choice of plants to support these pollinators. And then a little at the end about the availability of the plants that we use here at the gardens, and maybe that you want to get a hold of as well. And we can discuss that at the end if you like. So when it comes to planting for pollinators, I mean, some people may say, why bother? But, I think the majority of us realize, probably on this talk, that a large proportion of our food is actually pollinated by insects. And so it is very important to our existence, okay? And when we think of pollinators, we're not just thinking of bees and butterflies, although those are probably the most important pollinators, but we also look at other insects too. We're trying to plant and develop and design our gardens with the plants to actually encourage herbivores, insect herbivores, to encourage a wide array of insects, because we want to sort of design our gardens for birds. We're designing our gardens, you know, for other wildlife that we want to live alongside, and we think that's really important. And this is what I say. So some of you know, we're not just wanting to grow plants that are useful to humans, and the Discovery Garden is actually a vegetable garden for us and for people, but we actually specifically in the Bloomquist try to grow plants that are more important to the wildlife. So we have, you know, the American plum there, we have hawthorns, we have the native roses, and the burnums and things like that, which are valuable to birds, they're valuable to so squirrels and other animals. And coming on to the bird story, so same as in the UK, tremendous amount of money is spent by homeowners on feeding birds. And I have to put hand on heart, we buy seed and we buy suet, and we love watching the birds come to the bird feeders. And in recent years here at the gardens, because at the Bloomquist, we've been feeding birds throughout the year, and we've actually stopped doing that as much now. In part because we're concerned more about spreading of disease. That's one of the aspects. So we will feed the birds in the winter and maybe into the sort of the early spring and into fledgling times and things like that. But we don't do it through the summer, and we're certainly not doing it in the fall and the autumn. There's been some studies in the UK, and I think there are other studies more than just the UK, but I read these particularly just recently about almost talking about some of this food being almost like fast food for the birds. And also this idea that some of the birds there's been competition between birds, and they sort of, feeders sort of select certain types of birds, a bit more aggressive ones, and not the other types of birds. So they've done some real studies on this too. And actually our bottom line is really, you know, we should be planting for the birds. And as it says here, actually suet and seed doesn't feed the chicks. And, you know, there's been this study that's shown that since the 1950s and since the 1970s, the last 50 years, in terms of population numbers, there's like 3 billion birds have disappeared. And is that the habitats disappeared? I mean, when you think of us still feeding all of the birds with all suet and bird seed, it's not making a lot of difference. And really, if we don't have the insects, we don't have the chicks, because chicks cannot be fed suet or seed. So we need to have insects. We need insects brought into the garden. And unfortunately, you know, there's back in 2019, 2020, there was these sort of studies were published, you know, about this idea of this insect apocalypse. And I'm of that age where you would travel in the car in the UK and you would see the insects hitting against, you know, your parents' car and the windscreen and the lights. That doesn't happen today, and it doesn't happen here either. There's been this dramatic drop in the amount of insects around for whatever reason. And, you know, we really need to bring the insects back, particularly if you're very excited about and wanting birds to survive, because they really do have to feed, you know, it's caterpillars and insects that have to go to baby birds. So going back to the suet and the seed, we do still feed them in the early spring so that maybe the adults can get a little bit more energy, so that they can then go and forage for insects, which they can take to their young. But really, we want to be encouraging people to plant a wide range of plants and trees and shrubs that will actually support these insects. And as an environment in the US and in the UK, 82% to 85% of people now live in urban environments. And so domestic gardens are becoming more and more critical to wildlife. And, you know, Britain is a lot smaller than here. I mean, England's the size of North Carolina, and we have 50 million people living there. So for us in the UK, the gardens are really critical to wildlife. And so when we think about the urban environment, I was in the UK 2 weeks ago, and I went to the Chelsea Flower Show there. And they are showing much more, looking at more sort of urban styled gardens, such as patios and balconies and and for us here with decks, thinking about green roofs, container plantings, because a lot of people now are living in apartments and they may not have the space that we have, you know, with maybe half an acre or a quarter of an acre or whatever it is we have as gardens. And we have to encourage these folks to try, and the people who live in these apartments, these smaller houses, to actually think about planting for wildlife as well, planting for pollinators. Throughout the cities, we have things like greenways, which we have here in North Carolina, the New York High Line, for example. Make more use of parking lots around the shops, around retail. And, you know, obviously things like here we have these power line rights of ways. So many of our urban spaces can be turned into wildlife habitats. And if you're interested, there's a landscape architect at Sheffield University called Michael Dunnett, who's doing quite a lot of this, what he's calling greening the grey, and bringing a lot of plants into downtown areas, and plants that aren't as formal looking. They're not just pansies. It's actually sort of, you know, plants that actually attract pollinators. And with that in mind, we have been doing a project here at Duke University, working with some of our colleagues about, and really it's an experiment, about can we actually change some of our medians, our parking medians, into more of a wildlife habitat, planting for pollinators. So instead of actually having grassy verges like these, which are actually mostly crabgrass, which has to get mowed at weekends, because here on the right is where the valets park for the hospital, and on the left and on the right is where the staff park. And these are about 12 feet wide and about, you know, a couple of 100 feet long. We're sort of now experimenting with what are good plants to plant there. You know, how much effort does it take to look after them? Because if we really are trying to persuade our people who actually, the facilities who look after this, how much does it cost? It needs to be easy to look after. What is the resource that it takes? How many times does somebody have to go out there and weed? Or how many times do they have to go out there and look after this space? At the moment, they have to go out and mow a few times a year on a Saturday, because they can't mow through the week because of all the vehicles. It has to look attractive. And again, that's very subjective. What does attractive mean? Because I have to say, I think that crabgrass looks pretty horrible. But, you know, people still seem to think that grass looks better than some of the plantings that they, you know, may say looks a bit of a mess and looks too wild. Some of these plants they have to be drought tolerant, because they're not going to get irrigated, they're not going to get watered. If they get full sun, the soil is usually very poor, but thankfully some of our native plants really like poor soil. They have to cope with cars, or particularly trucks that reverse over the top of these plants. They have people walking across them. Animals will be out there. Maybe we'll have some deer coming in and grazing. And we're constantly catching litter that keeps getting blown in and around the place. So these plants need to be pretty robust. Height of plants, they can't be much more than 30 inches, because really people are quite intimidated by tall plantings. They do not want plants much more than 30 inches, ideally about 2 feet tall. So we're already starting to get little sort of criteria of what is our palette that we can start using in these places. It has to have an acceptable appearance, whatever that actually means, but it has to look neat and tidy, or it has to look understandable or legible throughout the year. And obviously the plants have to be accessible. People have to be able to buy them, and they can't be expensive. And finally, they have to be attractive to pollinators. You know, we want insects coming here and pollinating and feeding off them and grazing off them and pollinating the plants. And then what is the benefit? Well, no mowing at weekends. And then the other positive thing is that it fits in with the green agenda, whether it's for universities, for industry. People like the idea of, you know, having these little pockets, we're calling them pocket prairies, these little prairies, or these plantings in these areas. So we started this in 2019, but in 2020 in September, this is sort of one example of what we do. We use this turf remover, and we remove this crabgrass turf off the surface. And then we've previously tested the soil for nutrients and, you know, pH and stuff like that. We've made our ideas about how we're going to design it, you know, how the plantings are going to be, which is what these markings are for. We always do direct drilling. Even in the Bloomquist, I'm not into rotivating, not into turning the soil over and digging the soil over. I was a soil microbiologist in the past, and I'm really wanting to maintain communities of fungus, mycorrhiza, bacterial communities, and not to disturb the soil too much. In addition to that, the more you disturb the soil, the more weeds are coming through. So we want to kind of keep that as minimalized as possible. And we don't fertilize in the fall, but we do add a little bit of organic slow release fertilizer in the spring to give them the plants a little bit of a boost. And these are, at this stage, these are all perennials, and we plant on average about 5 perennials, about 3-inch to 4-inch pots per square yard. If we were using plugs, we might put in about 7. And because the more you plant, the more it covers the surface and it outcompetes the weeds. And you don't want weeds, too many weeds, because that means it's more work for the people who have to come in to keep it tidy. People had always complained to us that they didn't like the grass because it got their feet wet before they went into the hospital, and they would have wet trouser legs and everything. So we put little stepping stones to help people get across the plantings, to make these plantings more appeal to the users of the parking lot. And I have to tell you, this is from the 2019 planting. This year they tend to take like 2 years, a full year, to really get established. They get no more water. They're not watered in more than the first time we plant them. We water them and mulch them, fine light mulch, and water them, and then they're left to their own concern. And we went back in the spring, bit of weeding, little light more mulch, which is what you see on the side here in April 2021. And then in the July, this particular planting was absolutely stunning. And then again, even in the summer this year, where we've had extremely hot, dry summer, even the grasses and some of this here is evening primrose. Here is just looking beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And the people at the parking lot really who use it, I would say the ones who come out and talk to us really, really like it. And the valets are very protective of it as well. They've started to really look after the environment around them and taking care of it. And in terms of the plants we chose, some of these were based on the experience I've had from the prairie and what would really tolerate free draining, dry soil, full sun. And these are the ones we came up with. And we're still experimenting. We're still trying a few plants out. But these are the ones that have really worked well with us. Particularly, we love evening primrose and we love the penstemon as well. But they have worked. They are really some of the backbone of the plants. And we can talk about them later again if you want some more information on these. So then moving on to this idea of what, garden design layout. And this is going to be brief, really. But you don't have to have a wild looking garden to be attractive to wildlife and insects. You can have a formal style garden, a modern contemporary looking one, a cottage garden, whatever. It's the plants you plant that are important. It's the diversity of plants and the succession of the plants throughout the seasons that's more important than the actual style. At the Oxford Botanical Garden a couple of years ago, I was out there, and I stood and stared at this border here, which looks like a very formal border and against a lovely wall. The majority of those plants there are southeastern US plants, with the helianthus, the eupatorium in the background, the phlox, the heleniums, the veronicastrum here, the culvert root, the baptisia, which would have flowered earlier. Here's some symphyotricum, some asters. It's very formal looking, but it's still our plants. It's still the beautiful plants that we have here in the Southeast. And they have it in a very formal looking garden. Again, I was at this just recently, I was over at Hyde Hall, slightly different design. This is in September. Echinacea, heleniums, and many of our grasses, some sumacs there too. This is the symphyotricums, just in these wide ranges of swathes of flowers. So, and then again, here that we've got Gora and Symphyotricum too. So it's just very, very beautiful. Again, you don't have to have things looking wild. They can be tidy and looking beautiful in our borders. So the studies show, and there's been studies done in the UK specifically, that shows that some of the wildest looking gardens are not necessarily the most diverse for wildlife. What you want is diversity of planting and diversity and having water there, having some little stone walls and a little, sort of stonework and things like that. So little skinks and things like that can hide in there. Places with water where you can have maybe some salamanders in there as well. And having plantings that start in the spring and go all the way through into the late fall to support that wildlife out there. it can be done in a very organized garden. It doesn't have to be the wildest looking garden. And just to give you an example, we have been doing some studies here in our gardens over the last few years, insect capturing, and we've done it in the Bloomquist, in our prairie, and we've done it in this Discovery Garden, which is a very tidy, organized garden, but it's very diverse. It's got native plants, but it's got non-natives too. It's got vegetables, it's got fruit, it's got wet areas, it's got dry areas. And most of the years that we've been doing this, the diversity of insects and the quantity of insects that we find in that particular area is greater than in any of the other areas of the garden at the moment. So because of the curator there, which is Jason Holmes, has really concentrated on putting more food for wildlife into his garden than anywhere else, even more than our natural looking prairie. So the choice of plants is really important here. And what you've got to think about, and again, from the background I come from, and I think of these mixed shrub and tree borders, to think of trees, and you think of layering with the canopy, then you think of shrubs, and you have the evergreen shrubs and the deciduous shrubs. I consider vines, and then you come to the perennials, spring flowering perennials, summer flowering perennials, and then these other plants such as the grasses and the ferns and the sedges, which are sort of like ground cover. So if you look at, if you read about Doug Tallamy and the work that him and his team do, they have these keystone plants for trees particularly. And at the top of that list are the oaks, but there are others like the maples and the cherries, these native plants. Here at Therapeutic Gardens, we have about 55 acres, and the native trees we have, of the majority of our trees, is 78% of them are native trees. And we have about 100 trees per acre because we have all of this recorded. So we actually already have in this area, even though we have non-native plants grown here as well throughout the gardens, we have a really huge food source for these caterpillars and all of these insects that like living on these native trees. And I've spoken with the landscape architect for Duke University, and over 90% of the trees throughout Duke University are actually native trees as well. So we're like an island, really. The whole gardens are like an island for wildlife. The keystone plants, again, 5% of native plants support over 75% of insect caterpillars. So, you know, we keep saying plant it and they'll come. So, you know, you have the dogwoods, and they can be very beautiful. I mean, the best trees to plant are if you only have space for one tree, then you need to be planting oaks. They support the widest range of insects. And then everywhere we have the tulip trees. And again, most of these, well, in my backyard, are way up high and the flowers are up there, but they also live off the vegetation too. I love the sourwoods and the redbuds. They have the most beautiful flowers. And I think we know that from the honey that's formed specifically from sourwood. And these are just sitting in our wild areas here. And again, being British, I mean, it's just amazing that many of your trees that you have as your wild trees here, we take over there and we put in our gardens, you know, as exotic trees, because we love them. Here at the gardens, here at Bloomquist, we have a lot of rhododendrons because, again, the quantity of rhododendrons that you have here in the Southeast is just unbelievable. I mean, anyway, I just can't go on. I mean, I could give you a whole talk on rhododendrons, the azaleas, the deciduous azaleas, as well as the evergreen, you know, rhododendrons that we have here. Again, amazing for pollinators, and the breadth of different types of pollinators too. And I love clethra. I have a lot of this in the garden here at Bloomquist. It tolerates sort of moist soil. It produces these most beautiful, sweet-smelling flowers. Slightly, I think about sort of June, July, something like that. And the more bred ones, the more cultivated ones, you can get pinks, but the wild species or wild type are white. They just got these most fabulous, sweet-smelling panicles of flowers. Itea, again, this is another plant that I absolutely adore. This is in the Bloomquist here, turning this fabulous color again in the fall, which again, if you're thinking about a design side of it, just looks lovely too, but it's full of food. And the berries, the vacciniums, Again, they turn beautifully colored in the fall. And then you've got this fruit for the birds, and then pollinators, flowers for the pollinators. Aesculus, we have three different types of bottle brush, but this particular one, the bottle brush buckeye, is a beautiful plant too. Beautiful flowers and full of insects and grows so easily. These plants just love it here. They just grow so easily without much effort. And the lindera and the spice bush, again, down by the water edge, we have these there too. Beautiful yellow color in the fall, most gorgeous berries, and then the color that's just outstanding. And it's a special, food source for the spice bush swallowtail. The use of the trumpet creeper, again, this is a more of a formal way of arranging it. It doesn't have to be just climbing up through the trees, but it can just clamber up through the trees. And the Lonicera, the trumpet honeysuckle for the hummingbirds, the maypops. I mean, the amount of plants that you have, native plants in this part of the world, is just unbelievable. It is just, you've got everything. And I know also from the if you go to the garden centers and if you go to nurseries here, they are very good at supplying trees and shrubs and vines. You have really good supplies of those locally. And what I want to mention here is about hedgerows, and that's why I just put this one again. I come from the land of hedgerows in the UK. It's very distinctive in the British landscape, and it is one of the most sort of biologically diverse structures, man-made structures, biological structures that we have in the UK. Some of our hedgerows are 300 years old, and there have been some to be identified as being almost 800 years old from old maps and things, that those hedges have been there all this time, and they're very diverse. And we're here at the gardens. I am experimenting with similar plants in a Native American shrub hedgerow. So we're trying American hazel, the crabapple, and the plum. I chose a hawthorn and witch hazel. And then amongst them, I'm putting the Carolina rose, clematis, and honeysuckle, which is, they just sort of plant and grow up through there. And hedges give shelter and protection to birds and other little animals. They have spring flowers, give them nectar and pollen. And then you have the foliage, the herbivore grazing of insects. And then you have the fall fruits and nuts. I mean, it's like, it's a habitat, basically. It's a habitat that we can create ourselves. And here at Duke, along the wall, just outside the Bloomquist Garden, along Flowers Drive, I'm experimenting with a native hedge. So during the winter, I planted these different plants, as I've just mentioned earlier, the different little saplings, these little whips, as they're called, bare rooted in a staggered way. A 4-foot wide hedge it's going to be. It's about 6 whips per square yard, and they're staggered. And now this is how they're looking now, and they've been growing this year. And next spring, I'll cut them right back down to the ground again to try and get them all to bush out, because you need them to be thick and bushy and producing lots of stems when you're producing a hedge. But this, I'm experimenting to see how well this actually creates a hedge here at the gardens using US native shrubs. So we plant our trees and shrubs in the fall. If you do plant them later than that, you really have to keep them well watered through the summer. And the heat that you have in this place in North Carolina is just unbelievable. I mean, in Britain, if we have a week where it's about 80 degrees, we think the world's coming to an end, seriously. And where my mum lives in the north of England, in Durham, if it's above 70, it's boiling hot. So here where we have the heat above 90 from, say, sometimes from June through to September, day in, day out, and sometimes with no rain, the plants have to be robust. And the plants like trees and shrubs, really, if you do not want to waste them, you really have to plant them in the fall. That's the best time. The ground's still warm. You can get them in with root development. It's cooler now. I mean, September was a little warm, but October, the temperatures have dropped at night. The temperatures have dropped during the day. We've got a bit more rain coming in. It's just a nicer time for the plants to really start putting out their roots and start to get into the ground. Because if they're planted later in the year, like in the spring, they're starting to put out their leaves, and you're getting They're going to start photosynthesizing, and they're going to be stressed before they've even put their roots into the ground. So you really need to get their roots into the ground and growing well. And from my observation here, it can take up to 2 to 3 years for the plant, a native plant, shrub, or small tree, to really get its roots into the ground. And each summer we have to water them for about 3 years if we don't get rain. So if we don't get rain through the summer, we have to irrigate them. If we get rain through the summer, that's fine. But generally, you have to keep an eye on them for almost 3 years before we can say, okay, I think they're going to be okay. So I don't know how much detail you need of planting a shrub, but the way we do it, we do bare root containers and ball and burlap. And if the pot is pot bound, the roots are pot bound, and when you take them out, I tell you, I've taken the spade to mine sometimes and just hacked the sides off altogether and really just cut those roots up. You've really got to disturb those roots. You don't want them going round and round in circles. You have to sort of cut them off, and then they're ready to go into the soil as fresh roots. We tend to dig the hole about at least twice the size of the root ball. I always soak my bare roots. I water the containers or the root ball before planting and before putting it into the actual container, into the hole in the ground. Generally, you plant slightly proud in the hole, a little bit up. And my colleague here, Megan, she says she used to hear people say, plant them high and they never die, and plant them low, but you never know. So generally, not too high, but keep them a little bit up. Don't put them low into a hole in the ground and have it dip down, because you do not want water sitting in there over the winter period, because too much cold water can also rot the roots as well. So you want good free drainage. Add the soil into the hole. We tend to put in some fresh soil, not just the garden soil. We'll bring fresh soil and put it into the hole around the roots. We don't add fertilizer at that time of year, actually into the hole. Firm positioning of the plant in the soil. I'm very British. If you've seen some of these British TVs, we sort of stand on there with our feet and just really puddle it down around the tree or around the shrub and make sure it's firm. The roots like to be firm. And then water really well again after planting. And then I put a bit of mulch around, a bit of compost around the top, and a bit of mulch around to protect it at the base of the tree or shrub. And then often we can create a moat with the mulch, so that when you actually put the water in, it will hold the water in around the base of the tree, so it soaks down instead of being washed away and run off. And just be cautious that during the winter, if it's very dry during the winter, some of these trees can still die. So if it's dry, we will actually soak the plant at least once a month. But if it rains, then we find. But we do to go down and just check that everything is okay in and around the roots to make sure that they are getting sufficient moisture. Perennials. So let me just check the time to make sure we're okay here. Yeah. Perennials. We have spring perennials, and we have we like this layering of spring perennials here in the Bloomquist. We have the trees, and then we have the shrubs like this rhododendron, and this sable minor is an evergreen shrub. Then underneath the ground cover of the perennial ground cover, and the ferns too, and the celandine poppy here, and this is Phacelia here. And having some of these early spring woodland flowers helps catch early pollinators. One of my favorites is the ruin anemone here on the right, but we have a really nice array of, again, you have the most amazing plants here, again, in the woodland, early woodland plants with the ruin anemones. You have you have the May apples, celandine poppies, the bluebells, and then obviously we have the bloodroots, and there's the bluebells coming in, and the green and golds, and the ferns. Just stunning plants you have. And heavens, the trilliums. This is Stiminium. The trillium plants you have, we have about 28 different species actually at the Bloomquist here. And we've had them in the garden for about 40 years of different species. And they walk, they hybridize, they move around by the ants, the seeds are everywhere. They just pop up everywhere. And that's another reason why we don't do a lot of disturbance of the ground, because we want to make sure that we don't damage any of the plants that are just naturally migrating around the garden. Dicentra here, we have the Dicentra and the irises and the Spigelia. Again, stunning plants that you have, and that will attract pollinators. And I love this Phacelia, which covers naturally. It's a biennial, and throughout the garden in the spring, probably about April, May. We just have this beautiful blue color throughout the garden. And then it just sort of dies through the summer, dies back through the summer because it's so hot, but it's absolutely covered in pollinators. So what we tend to do at our place is there's a cutoff point for when we will walk on these borders, because if you start going on the borders around December, November, like December, January, many of these spring flowers are already just sitting there waiting, ready to pop about the ground. And so we don't want to go on the borders any much later than September, October. So if we're weeding them, and we don't do this every year, we probably do this every 2 or 3 years, we will weed the spring borders. We may add some more soil and compost if necessary, and mulch lightly, and just to give them a little bit more feed for the spring show and the show of flowers in the spring. And sometimes we will also supplement our planting. If we think the previous year has looked a little bit down and we want to add more plants, we might supplement some of the spring planting around about now as well, adding more ferns or adding some more spring flowers. And some of those spring flowers that we add are in September and November, because most of them are these sort of geophytes. They're like bulbs, they're bulbous or tuberous roots. We will add those between September and November, and we will purchase them, or we will have propagated some of our own or made some divisions. And we can also do this work in March and May as well. So when some of our trilliums are coming to sort of die back, we can then transplant them there and then take them and put them somewhere else. And they're actually very good and easy to transplant. Just don't want to do them too deep. And something like bloodroot, you keep them quite close to the surface, and they like to be in free draining soil as well. Again, it's just understanding the plant. Unlike the bluebell, it likes a bit moisture, and they like to be in a moist area. So so you got to really just understand what is the habitat that your plants live in, and where do they prefer to be. So it's just a gradual understanding. And we often are moving plants around here at the Bloomquist. We divide them. Sometimes we're going to do some work in an area of the garden, so we call it healing in. So we don't want to lose them. We will just put them into pots, cover them over this, especially ferns and things, and just cover them lightly with the soil. Make sure it's all free drained, and we give them a good watering, and then we put them somewhere like in our nursery just to leave them until we want to grow them again. And during the winter, we don't allow these pots to freeze. So we do look after all of the pots during the winter period when everything is dormant. And then summer flowering, we have the most amazing plants. I mean, we have, again, the penstemon. I adore the penstemon. This is lepigatus, spigelia. You know, I don't know why this isn't grown more often here. It's just a stunning plant. Monarda, great because it doesn't, the deer don't eat it very well. And again, I haven't mentioned much about deer, but every time we give talks here, it's always, does the deer eat it? The main thing about deer is they don't like the mint family. Anything that's got flavor to it, they do not like mint. And they also tend to not like things like Amsonia, anything that's got that sap inside, and Asclepias and things, because it's a little bit toxic to their taste. Here we are with Asclepias. And Eryngium, again, like Asclepias, it likes a little drier. And Echinaceas, tons. I mean, my colleague gave a talk on this just recently, how many different cultivars of Echinacea are present these days. Again, people asked about cultivars as compared to the wild species. Have a look at Mount Cubis studies. They have done, a couple of times, they've done studies on Echinacea, and they have shown that there's quite a number of the cultivars that are just as good for pollinators as the wild species. And Coreopsis is the same. So they've done a whole range of different native plants and their cultivars. So there's some really good studies there for Mount Cuba, if you want to have a look at that. Rudbeckias, a whole range of Rudbeckia. I think some of these can be a bit garish, some of the, for my personal taste, some of the cultivars, but I prefer the straight species of these. That's just my personal taste, but we have Laciniata, the cutleaf, we have Fuldiger, and you have I love Triloba and Herta. So some of them, you know, are very good. Again, many different cultivars, but I prefer to go for straight species. And they have a tendency to like a little on the moist side as well. And something like that is not so much my taste. that's like the triloba there. And then mints, the mint family, unbelievable. This is Incarnum, and I like to use the tenuifolium, which is the narrow minted one, which is quite short, on many of our plantings, particularly on the H-lock, because it's just a short plant, but it absolutely is covered in insects. Beautiful plant, lovely structure, and holds structure throughout the summer as well. Eupatoriums, the conoclinum, the mist flower, that is a good plant. The deer don't eat it so much at my house. It's a really lovely late flowering plant, and I love it next to Eurybia, the wood aster, because it will tolerate both sun and some shade as well. Helianthus, the sunflowers. You have I think about 7 different species here in North Carolina, and there's some beautiful sunflower species. The one I prefer is Helianthus atrorubens. I really love that plant. Don't seem to be able to get it very much in the nurseries, but it's one of the most beautiful plants that I prefer as a sunflower. And then Solidago, if you listen to Doug Tallamy, he will say that this is probably the key species to actually have in your garden for insects. So it can be a bit aggressive. In fact, some of them can be very aggressive. So you've got to be very careful about which ones you put in and keep an eye on them. But that's fireworks, and that's okay, the rugosa. And it's a nice plant, a nice structural plant, but you just got to keep an eye on them. But they're amazing for pollinators. And I say Symphyotricums, I love the Eurybia, the wood aster, and that looks fabulous with the purple from the conoclinums. And these really take us through into the frosts almost. They're just starting to bloom now, and we're in October now. Fabulous plants. And grasses, again, the grasses are amazing plants too. And I'm looking at the time here, and this time's clicking on, so I want to get onto questions. But we use a lot of grasses to give us structure throughout the winter, and then we cut them down in the spring. So we all cut the prairie, and we cut our plantings down about late February, beginning of March. But these really give you texture. They give you structure and protection against for the birds in the winter, and for insects overwintering. And so we tend to plant our summer flowering perennials between September and November when the soil's really warm. Then again, we'll try March to May. They'll be cautious about watering, but we want to get them established a little bit early. But June to August, it can be done, but you've got to take great care. You've got to keep them watered if it does get dry. But they're really tough plants. We find our native perennials really tough, and they will tolerate some of the heat in the summer. And for our ground preparation, I won't go into too much of this, but basically it depends on the plants. Acid-loving plants you've got to be careful about the pH, free draining soil. You really need to know about the plant itself. Read about it, check it out, see what sort of soil it prefers to live in. A lot of the plants that we're finding really like free draining soil and a lot of sun, and they do much better. And we have this Helianthus schweiниtzii, which is an endangered species, and we've grown it in garden soil. And comparing how it grows in garden soil to natural soil, and we see this a lot in the garden, it's a different plant. Some of the plants look like they're on steroids, and they don't look the same. And so that's an interesting observation that we've seen. And they often don't produce as much seed either for the birds. So plant availability, garden centers, obviously, and online purchasing. And then we do a lot of our own propagation. Cuttings with things like hydrangeas. We've been doing cotinus layering and lots of plants like layering. We do an awful lot of seed collection. We propagate every year because we just need so many plants. We go online to order plants. We can't always guarantee we're going to get them. It's really difficult. So we just do a lot of our own preparation, and we do a lot of divisions too. So that's it, and thank you. And hopefully that wasn't too much I've shoved in there, but any questions you're welcome to ask.
Thank you, Annabelle. That was awesome. And the pictures were really fantastic as well. So we do have some questions. I think the first one I'm going to start with, well, actually, I'm going to mention, because we've had several questions asking about if we can provide lists of some of the plants that you mentioned. And yes, I think we can certainly do that. So what I'll probably do is compile all the information that Annabelle provided, and I'll send it out. When I send out the email notifying everyone that this recording has been uploaded to our YouTube channel, I'll also send out a list of resources, including the species that Annabelle listed today, including some other information that folks provided. So that will all be sent out within the next week or so. So Annabelle, one of the first questions is, what was the blue spring flower spread out in the shade that you mentioned 10 or 15 minutes ago?
That was Phacelia, and I'm going to be finding it difficult. I'll write it down for you. It's something like Bipinnifidia or something like that. So it's a Phacelia, and I don't think there's a common name. I think Phacelia is just its common name, but it's a local one. If you go online and look up Phacelia, you can find ones from the west coast, but this is an east coast one. What I'll do is I'll write it down for you in the chat, and because my pronunciation isn't very good. So I'll write it down, and then you can get that. But it's not easy to get a hold of. I have to tell you, it's not easy to get a hold of. And so last year, I actually took a lot of the plants and you know, as they were drying, and put them into bags, and then just left them there. And now I've got a lot of seed. But you can't. It's one of those things. We just can't. I wish more people would grow these things. It's a stunning plant, absolutely stunning plant. And if only more people would grow them, you know, people could get access to the seed as a crop, as a cover crop even, you know, or cover for your garden, or cover for, you know, just to feed you know, as an early flowering. It just looks beautiful. So yeah, I'll write it down for you. Okay.
I believe I've always heard it pronounced Phacelia the way that you pronounce it, so I believe that's the correct way to say it.
No, it's the species epithet that I was going to.
Oh, the species, not the genus.
Yeah,
okay.
It's Bipinnatifida. So it's B-I for bi, Pinnatifida. Okay. Did you get that?
Well, we'll include that in the notes that we send out, and the list of resources that we send out to all the folks that have registered. And maybe if we have several questions, but maybe if we have a minute or two left over, we can talk a little bit about some of the native nurseries around here, some of the resources. If we don't get to that, then I'll certainly include a list of native nurseries in the resources that get sent out in the next week or so. Maybe that's a better way to do it.
Yeah, the common name is fernleaf Phacelia, because it's got a very ferny leaf to it, but it is beautiful.
So Patricia says, I have butterfly weed with a lot of seed pods. Can I harvest those seeds before the pod opens and then save the seeds and broadcast them next spring? Or is it better to put them in small pots and grow them over winter and then transplant in spring?
So you're talking about tuberosa. The way I leave it is that, so most seeds, so when I started doing this work with the prairie, I was new to doing this several years ago, and you learn by, you know, just doing this planting, harvesting seed. The best thing to do is leave plants always, or leave seeds till as late as possible, before they're basically kicked off the plant, or before animals eat them or birds eat them, because they're the most ripe then. But with the Asclepias, I tend to leave them until they really have popped open and the seeds are looking brown. And then I put them in a bag, and then I just sort of, you know, separate them off. And we have been I mean, you probably know this yourself about how to propagate them. We've been experimenting with propagation. And if they're quite fresh, they will propagate quite quickly. We put them into, what do you call it? Not vermiculite. We put it into vermiculite, a moist vermiculite, for like a week or 2 weeks at, fridge temperature. We've been putting them in room temperature and put them in the fridge to see if we can actually get more plants. And they actually, you know, they propagate quite quickly, even at room temperature in a moist vermiculite. And putting them in the fridge, you just slow it down, the germination a little bit. In fact, I've left them in there for like 2 months, and it just slows it that you can leave them in there for 2 months, and then you can propagate them along with everything else. It's just up to you, but it's your timing. I would actually just put them in vermiculite, put them into, a dark space with moisture, with water. So water and vermiculite, put them into a cupboard in room temperature, And then, then they'll start germinating, and then you can just transfer them into your pots.
Okay.
So it all depends really what you have to look after them through the winter. So we would do that, and then we would put them into our hoop house. But if you haven't got a greenhouse or a hoop house or anything like that, then just leave this until the spring when it's warmer.
Okay. Can you give some more information on annual plant sales that Duke offers? And I know it's been a little bit different with COVID this past year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, normally we do it in the spring and the fall, and it's going to come back to that. Because of COVID, we haven't, and we've just had a small, almost pop-up sale for members just this last weekend. But it's for members because we didn't have many plants. So we can't like open up a sale when we've only to the public if we've only got, a few hundred plants. We have to get a lot more plants together to open it up to the public. Otherwise, everyone's going to be disappointed. So it's down to Duke really for us to say we're allowed to have these open sales. And once we're allowed to have them, then we will have them again. But normally it's in about March, April, and then in September. And then the spring sale, we have other vendors here as well as ourselves. And then the fall sale is just us. And
how are those advertised? Can people find that information on your website or social media? Yeah. What's the best way?
Yeah, I mean, they do advertise it on social media, but they would have to go onto Duke's website and social media. And we do have a lot of big membership as well that comes to see them, but it is advertised, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, Sarah wants to know what's the best way to plant the woodland species, and how do you
plant them?
To plant them, and then how do you deal with the tree roots?
Well, it depends on what species we're talking about. Like the bluebells and Virginia bluebells, they like it moist, so their natural place is like on a floodplain, and they like it to have a moist soil. So you want to make sure where you put them for them to really grow well is a little bit damp, not boggy, but a little bit damper and not too dry. Roots, how do we grow around roots? If I'm digging in the ground, and again, I don't rotivate or anything like that, I just dig around. If I come to some thick roots, I would just dig somewhere else. So if it's too thick with roots, then I will not plant plants there if it's too thick into the ground. But a lot of these spring flowers are tuberous roots, are corms, a bit like bulbs in a way. If you want to think things like daffodilly type of things, tulips, they're more like they're called geophytes, so they have storage organs. And they tend to be okay. I mean, I would just look for, I would just sort of make a hole in the ground and put them in, but don't put them too low down. That's what some of our plants, they don't like to be too low. Trilliums don't like to be too low, maybe about an inch or so down. The bloodroot likes it to be dry, and they'd like to just sit under the surface. So it depends on the specific plant we're talking about, really. And I think they need to sort of just check them out, yeah, but if I come across a root, I don't damage the root. I leave the roots and I go somewhere else. I move a foot away and plant it in a foot away or 6 inches away from the roots.
Okay. So then the last question had to do with where to buy some of these plants. And so unless you want to talk more specifically about it, I can provide a list to all the participants about the native nurseries that we have across the state, unless you want to mention a few that are particularly great for what you purchase, or it's up to you if you want to.
Well, I was just going to say with this cure, there used to be niche. Plantworks actually only supplies to wholesalers. A lot of them are only wholesale nurseries. To be honest with you, we often go outside of the state to get plants. Because we don't always have the range that we're looking for. You can go to the botanical garden as well at Chapel Hill. They have a few plants available, but again, it depends on the quantities that you're after. I mean, like I say, my colleague Megan, she's going to be planting 2,500 to 3,000 plants over at the Lima Center. You can't just buy those easily, at your local nursery. Or your local garden center, and actually it would be expensive too. So we do a lot of our own propagation, but actually, somewhere like southern states, they do often have a really nice range of local of native plants, native perennials. both species and cultivars. I'm often surprised, like Southern States down at in Carrboro, they often have a really nice supply of plants, as does the Durham Garden Centre along Hillsborough Road. I don't know where else you are, because I'm in Durham and Chapel Hill is where I'm located. But it's surprising how many local garden centres actually do supply a lot of perennials of flowers. And as I say, the nurseries for trees and shrubs and vines and things are very good. People like Taylor's. I mean, I can supply you with some of the ones we go to, you know, to buy some of these shrubs. They're well supplied with native shrubs and trees. It tends to be the perennials it's a little bit reduced, you know, choice.
Right. And then just one last quick question, and this might not be such a quick question, but we're at 2 o'clock, so I don't want to hold up any people, but do you have any specific recommendations planting from seed versus bare root or live stake versus from a pot?
For what?
Just in general, if you're planting in your garden.
I mean, I have my own garden at home, and, you know, I'm starting from scratch. Again, it all depends on what you want and how many years you've got ahead of you. So if you're if you've got a long time ahead of you and you want to do things from seed or from, you know, from cuttings, then by all means, that's the cheapest way of doing it. And you can grow trees from seed. So I've grown crab apples from seed. I've grown persimmon from seed. And I've done cuttings with cotinus and stuff like that. It would probably take me 2 to 3 years to get a plant that would be the equivalent of going to the shop and buying one, if you see what I mean. So again, all of that depends on your time, how much time you have to create your garden, and also the species that what you're after. Because the shops, I call it the shops, but if you go to the garden centers, you're often limited by the range of plants you can get a hold of. If you go to, you know, you get cuttings and smaller plants and seeds from the wild or whatever, or from, you know, and you've got to be cautious about taking them from the wild, as you know, or even your friend's garden that they gave you, they may not be in these garden centers, and that might just take you a little bit longer to do. I mean, we find always, and I think everyone will say this, the smaller the plant, the better they will establish over time, because they'll get the roots down and they will survive better than putting in a great big, you know, if you put in and we've seen this with kalmias, for example. I'm tempted sometimes to go and buy a kalmia from the Carolina Native Nursery in the mountains, and it's in a ball and burlap, and it looks beautiful shrub, about, you know, 3 to 4 feet high and stuff like that, and then it dies on you. You put it in the ground and you can't keep it alive, or the same with the rhododendrons in the summer. But you put in a 3-gallon pot or a 1-gallon plant, and that plant will survive much better. And within about 5 years, that plant has got to the stage of the sort of the 4-foot one. But you've got to wait for those years. So it's you know, I think I would rather go with smaller stuff and wait than go with big stuff and lose it, I guess, and pay a lot of money. I don't know if that's you know, there's just not one answer to this, but I would tend to go for smaller stuff, really.
That makes sense.
And the bare rooted stuff, by God, that is cheap. All of those hedges, each of those was like 60 cents. So I bought those down in Georgia of a nursery. I think it was native woodland or something. Nursery, native forest or something in Georgia, and they were like 60 cents each. You know, and I could have a tree from those in a few years, and that's very cheap. So you know, again, I would look for bare rooted for that expense. It depends what you're doing. Bare rooted always for hedges, always.
All right.
Sorry.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time. So thank you so much. Everybody send a virtual thank you to Annabelle. That was a great presentation. And keep your eyes out for the email coming in the next week or so with the link to this presentation and a lot of resources that we'll provide from you resulting from this discussion. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Not always easy to answer some of these questions off the top of your head, really, because it's what if? So what I'll do is, Gabriella, I'll get a list of my plants and also